Welcome, everyone. My name is Deborah Cunningham, and I'm the Senior Program Director at Primary Source. Primary Source is an organization that works with K-12 teachers to help them globalize the curriculum and support them in their efforts to bring the world into their classrooms. So we work on all world regions. And tonight we feel so fortunate to be able to share with you some work that grew out of a project on the Ottoman Empire. In the summer of 2013, Primary Source traveled with 30 teachers to Turkey, to several cities, but with a focus on Istanbul, to learn about Ottoman cultures. And tonight's webinar on teaching Ottoman arts is an outgrowth of that project. We're lucky to have Deb Rosenbaum of the Denver School of the Arts here. She was one of the participating teachers in the tour, and she will be sharing with you some of what she's done in her class since that time. We also have our lead scholar for the tour, Barbara Petzen, joining us this evening from Middle East Connections. Barbara's been working in the field of outreach and working with teachers around the Middle East for about a decade now, and she's an expert on Ottoman history and culture. So we have a fantastic lineup for you, and we're so pleased that you've taken time on this beautiful summer evening to join us to learn about Ottoman art and what the possibilities might be for your classroom. And we hope that you'll go away inspired and full of questions and share your comments and questions with us as we proceed this evening. So thank you for joining us. It's lovely to have you with us. The way the webinar will be structured is that Barbara will lead off and introduce herself and be giving you an overview for about 20 minutes about some key features of the art of the Ottomans. And then Deb will take over and talk about ways she has brought the inspiration of the Ottomans into her classroom and done hands-on work with high school students. If you're not a high school teacher, that's fine. You can contribute and ask questions relevant to your own grade level, though the webinar will have a primary focus on secondary teaching and its examples. And I just want to say before we get going any further that this webinar is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. We've had their support throughout this project and their assistance in bringing it out to the wider world of U.S. teachers across the country. So thanks to them for their support. All right, Barbara, I think that you are on.
I'm on. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so
yes, we can hear you.
If somebody can hear, okay, great. So what I would like to do is talk just a little bit about the Ottoman Empire to begin with and why we're even interested in the Ottoman Empire, and to stress the two themes that I think are going to carry through most of what we're talking about. And then I think that I'll run through a number of different slides just really illustrating these two tendencies. Of course, it's incredibly frustrating for any scholar to try and talk about any part of their field in 20 minutes, but that's the assignment. So I will try to be really brief and just focus on kind of really concrete takeaways and things that you can see, and then leave it to Deb to really talk about classroom application. And then we can come back in the Q&A part, and if there's anything that I haven't made clear, please feel free to ask those questions. And if you want to, again, ask those questions while we're going through, just go ahead and put them down in the chat box, and we will collect them and come back to them at the end. So I think that what I really want everybody to take away from this is two things about Ottoman art, which I think ought to be obvious, but very often people either assume that the Ottomans are do one thing or the other and not both. And the first is that the Ottomans are the great synthesizers, not only in art, of course, in law, in the field of military technology, and strategy in terms of a whole variety of social and cultural endeavors. The Ottomans are very, very eager to look at the surrounding civilizations, and in fact some civilizations that are very far away, and to take from those civilizations the things that they think are amenable to Ottoman advancement, legitimacy, pride, showing off, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing at the same time is that the Ottomans were intensely proud of their own culture and saw themselves as developing a purely Ottoman style of doing things. That, you know, in some ways I think of the Ottomans as a lot like America, in the sense that Ottoman style was conceived of as something that was an agglomeration and an addition to and a refinement of elements that came from other places. Like the United States, they were multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, and all of those things came to play in the artistic traditions that developed under them. So, oh, I lost a slide somewhere about the Ottomans. So let me just say briefly that the Ottomans, you know, are typically seen as either the boogeyman of Europe, you know, the scary other that was set to take over Europe for a good deal of the period of the Renaissance and after, or they're seen as the sick man of Europe, right? So the Ottomans tend to only get seen as either a scary startup or, you know, a dying relic. And both of those tend to focus on the military aspects of the Ottoman Empire rather than on cultural, social, and artistic aspects, which, being a social historian, I think are very, very interesting. So let's look at some of the ways in which those major themes come out. Architecture is probably the most visible element of this because the Ottomans had a very, very strong tradition of underwriting architecture, particularly kind of monumental architecture, mosques and palaces, but also urban architecture in things like fountains and you know, houses in the city and khans to make commercial activity possible, and you know, a whole host of buildings and urban infrastructure that would both help the urban environment to function efficiently and redound to their the benefit of the founder of the particular institution. Sultans, of course, underwrote mosques in their own name, but it's also the case that many, many other officials did the same thing, and members of the Sultan's family. So I just want to point out here, the Ulu Jami was the first major congregational mosque that we have in the Ottoman Empire, and I want you to look at it for a second, and can anybody point out what seems to be missing from what we would normally expect to see in Ottoman architecture? We have our minarets. What's not there? A great big central dome, right? Typically, when we look at Ottoman mosques, you see this huge dome in the center, kind of the Disney World effect, as I call it, right? No dome here. So until the Ottomans got to Istanbul, they really didn't have this fixation on a huge central dome. In fact, the mosques were set up, and I'm not sure, oh, I can't do it here. This is actually a panorama, and you can scan side to side in this mosque and really get a sense that it is an enormous space under this multiplicity of domes. But the space is not, it actually is quite high. I mean, can you see the guy sitting down over here? Where's my little pointer guy? Oh, I'm not finding the right one. Oh, here we go. Is that it? Okay. See this little guy over here? That's human scale, okay? So you get a sense of just how, here's another guy over here. So you get a sense of just how big this mosque is, but it actually, this is one of about 3 sideways panels in this panorama. So think of this picture as being 3 times as wide, and you get a sense of the scale. That is, it's got a very horizontal feeling rather than a very vertical feeling. And that was a very important part of the Ottoman ethos at the beginning of the period because it had this very strong sense of egalitarianism. These were tribal people. Even though they were starting an empire, there was a sense that everybody is, you know, in this thing together, and the idea was to bring everybody under one roof, right, or a whole bunch of little domes. So you could pack an enormous number of people into this mosque, and you would be able to see everyone, and the focus would be on that breadth of people praying together on the ground, right? We'll come back to the decoration, but I just want to point out the horizontality of this particular mosque. Then the Ottomans get to Istanbul and take over Istanbul in the middle of the 15th century. And of course, they come across this amazing, wonderful building, the Hagia Sophia, or the Hagia Sophia in Turkish. And this is the cathedral, of course, of the Byzantine Empire. And so the Ottomans come in and they do what all conquerors do, is that they take the major institutions architecturally or symbolically of the previous regime and take them over and adapt them to their own use in order to make the statement that we are now the new honchos in town, right? So they do that exact same thing with the Hagia Sophia. They make it into the congregational mosque for the Ottomans. They don't do this with every church, right? This is just with the major cathedral, and over time, other churches get made into mosques, get taken over, but it's not something that happens en masse. This one, though, they absolutely take over, and to do that, of course, they take this, and I'm sorry, I meant to grab the image of the Hagia Sophia, a rendering of it without the minarets, so that you could see what it looked like before the transition to a mosque, without these four very different minarets around it, but I totally forgot to do that. So inside, you can see what was so amazing about the Hagia Sophia. In this church, they built this incredible dome that has an enormous amount of space inside, under the dome, both in terms of breadth, but also what is most stunning about it is the vertical space. So when you walk into this place, you just feel dwarfed, not by the horizontal scale of the thing, but the huge vertical scale. So this was a challenge to the Ottomans, to their engineering skills, to their artistic and aesthetic ideas and skills, a challenge to them that, okay, you could come and take this over, but as long as you're just taking over this cathedral, you're kind of second fiddle, right? It seems like you're not really the top dog if you can't match what they had made so long before. So for the Ottomans, they really wanted not just to come in and take this over, but to best it. And so they tried various times, particularly under Suleiman the Magnificent, who had the great good fortune to have a magnificent engineer turned architect in his employ named Sinan. And Sinan tried very hard to best this with a number of mosques. Just here's another version of that. But his crowning glory, certainly in terms of space, I think, is the Suleymaniye. I would also show you the Selimiye in Edirne, but since we're kind of focused on Istanbul, I thought I would keep it to the Suleymaniye. So this gives you a sense of the exterior of the Suleymaniye. You know, in contrast to the exterior of the Hagia Sophia, which of course has the obviously added on minarets, this is a much more harmonious package. The other piece about it that people often don't talk about is that the Suleymaniye is not just a mosque. It's a whole complex of buildings. A soup kitchen, a poorhouse, a hostelry for visiting clergy, a bathhouse, a hospital, you know, a library, a huge number of buildings and functions that were associated with the mosque. So there's, of course, the obvious competition over the dome, but there's also a sense in which this mosque, which is much higher in terms of its commanding position on the peninsula, so it's higher than the Hagia Sophia, and it encompasses so much more of the functions of or urban functions that the Sultan is underwriting, that it's a challenge in another way, in a social way, to the Hagia Sophia. And here you can just see all of these buildings around this are all part of the mosque complex, right? So it's huge. Then if we actually go into the mosque itself, this is what you see. And while the dome is actually, I think, about 3/4 of a meter shorter than the dome of the Hagia Sophia, because Sinan was able to open up the space under these arches so much, the amount of space that's actually under the dome is larger than the amount of space that's under the Hagia Sophia. So, of course, they declared it a triumph and that they had now won this contest. And they were so proud of it that they would, that there was this constant reference to the Suleymania here in a celebratory parade. They actually created a scale model of it to parade around through the streets as though everybody couldn't see the real deal up on the hill. At the same time, though, I don't want people to think that once the Ottomans beat the Byzantines and created this very Ottoman style of mosque, that they stopped innovating. In fact, they were in constant dialogue with other artistic traditions, including that of Europe. And here you have this 19th century mosque in Ortaköy, up the Bosphorus a little bit. And I hope that you can see that it has this very kind of neo-Baroque style, very, very highly ornamented style in the decoration of the mosque here. The same thing here with the Dolmabahce Palace. We could also look at the Chiraon Palace or the Yıldız Palace. Many different mosques and buildings and palaces have this very European 19th century architectural decoration and form, right? This is a very different style of palace than the Topkapı Palace that they had been in before. And then, of course, this is a very late Ottoman building, the barracks that the new government or the current government in Istanbul actually wanted to build a mall that looked like this. So they want to revive this Ottoman architecture, which is, of course, also modeled on European architecture of the time. So even now, even when there's an Ottoman revivalist movement, it's still looking at Ottoman models that were in dialogue with the West. So let me look a little bit at the decorative arts of what's in these mosques as well as in other things. The primary form of decoration is always calligraphy because of the primacy of the Quran for the Ottoman Muslims, of course. The calligraphy of the arts of the book in the Ottoman Empire were very, very highly developed, and calligraphy was one of the major arts, but it was also very important as a kind of monumental decorative mode. Here you can see these very, very huge decorative panels in calligraphy. And what I want to point out, if you look over here, for example, at the green one, you can see that this is mirror calligraphy. So this says Huwa, He, Allah. So He is God. And it's mirrored and attached so that it you see the same thing twice, forwards and backwards. And that's meant, of course, to evoke the idea that our goodness on earth should reflect the perfection of paradise, that God is eternal and eternally reflected, etc., etc. So there are all kinds of Sufi meanings, for example, that you can read into this. And every panel that you see here is done in mirror calligraphy. Then the other way that calligraphy takes form is as signatures, as a kind of cipher signature that other people would find it very, very difficult to forge. This is a letter from Suleiman to the King of France, and he uses this as the equivalent of a red wax stamp on the back of a letter, right? Nobody would be able to forge this without it being obvious because it's so highly decorative and so highly unique. So he had one guy who was, oversaw the painting or the drawing of this tura on official documents, right? And here's another example of that mirror calligraphy. That is that it doesn't have to be just one reflected on one dimension. It can be reflected in many dimensions. And here's another major thing that the Turks really, or the Ottomans, I should say, really focused on, and that's what we used to call arabesque until scholars of Persian art got very annoyed that we were using terminology that seemed to leave them out of it, and of course the Turks as well. So we now call them stylized vegetal patterns. But you can see, of course, that you have this kind of sense of vines and vegetation, stylized, but at the same time for the Ottomans it was also very important that you could tell what the plants were. And if you look, this is one of the places where you can really see how the Ottomans are indebted to artistic traditions of China. So many of the forms that they use of these plants are actually coming from Chinese artistic models. And then, of course, there's geometry. And the use of color and geometry is just constant in the Ottoman palette. I'll come back to this in a second. So you can see here, for example, in one room, you have these geometric forms made out of wood. So the idea is the presence and absence of darkness and light. You have these vegetal patterns in these tall ceramic tiles here. And of course, you have the same kinds of things on the rug and on the upholstery of the furniture. Over and over again, these vegetal patterns, geometric patterns, repetition, and calligraphy appear again and again. You can't quite see, but up here at the top, there's actually a border of calligraphy. I should have set the picture in a little bit better. And here you can see in another mosque, the Rustem Pasha Mosque, again, geometry, vegetal design, calligraphy, the use of space, the use of light, and the use of color, all combined to create a kind of harmonious whole. And that was really, you know, the Ottomans loved many, many different patterns, but the trick was, could you blend them all in a way that feels good? The other thing I wanted to say, which I started off with this adorable little animal from Topkapi, which you can see here is a winged beastie, a winged boar beast of hoofed of some kind. I am not sure what that animal is, but it shows that the Ottomans did not do representational art. Very often we say that Muslims don't do representational art. So if you take one other thing besides those two themes away from this webinar, please take away that Muslims do make representational art very frequently. Here you can see a kind of, this is a book about the reign of kings and shows what goes on in terms of rule. And this is the tribute of boys, the Dev Shirmei in the provinces. So you can see here's the village priest, here are the boys who've been selected, here are the weeping mothers, and here's the guy counting out the coins that go to the family who are losing their sons to the draft. Here you have an audience with a sultan, and again, look at all the patterns in all the tile that's faithfully rendered here for people to look at in this book, right? So you reflect that decoration of the architecture in the arts of the book. They also made portraits. They did lots of family albums. And lots of pictures of things that went on in different kings' reigns. So these are not stylized portraits. These are real pictures of what real people looked like. And again, that's not something that we think of as being something that Muslims do. Of course, they also made representational drawings for much more prosaic purposes. This is the very famous Piri Reis map showing the early discoveries in the Americas. And here we have a siege of Nevşehir. So here you have, it's actually the Franks, the Europeans, who are besieging the city, the Ottoman city. Most of these miniatures actually show the Ottomans besieging cities in the Balkans. We have a zodiac map, a procession of the guilds. These are some of my favorite ones. I don't know if you can see here. This is in a circumcision parade. So to celebrate the prince's circumcision, you have all these people marching, and here you have the farmers who grow the grain, and then you have over here the guy who's carrying a board that has unbaked bread on it, and back here you have the oven, so that they're actually baking bread while they go through the parade and distributing it to the crowd, so everybody can see how good they are. Here we have the Sultan with a lot of lady musicians, and in fact also in religious texts. So here we have a scene from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. He's right here. He's supposed to be saving everybody from something, I can't remember if, what was meant to be in the heavens that he was meant to save everybody from. But here's obviously the Kaaba. So again, religious texts also could be illustrated with figural representation. And of course, other things. I picked a very tame version of a bathhouse scene. Some of them are slightly more risque. Here we have a bath boy. And of course, if you have not already read My Name is Red by Orhan Pamuk, I would really recommend it. It's a novel that is all about the kind of disputes within the artistic community in the Ottoman Empire about whether they should stick to quote-unquote Islamic norms and Ottoman style, or whether they should also import things from the West like Renaissance portraiture. Very, very fascinating murder mystery set around this kind of debate. So I will leave it there. That's really the kind of thing that I wanted to share with you. You know, really looking at those themes. Where can you see Chinese influence? Where can you see European influence? And where do you see the Ottomans trying to create an aesthetic that's all their own? And I'll leave it there. Deb?
Great. Thank you, Barbara. That was a wonderful introduction to types of Ottoman art and key themes running through the art. What we'll do now is turn to Deb Rosenbaum from the Denver School of the Arts in Colorado. She is a high school art teacher who has done a lot of work with students on Ottoman art, and she's going to share some of the projects and some of the ways that she's taken her learning about the Ottomans and their artistic traditions back to her classroom. Deb, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I want to just mention briefly what kind of school I teach at. It is an arts magnet middle and high school. So we have a really strong emphasis on art skills and art elements, art techniques, but we also study art history, and my goal is to kind of merge the two as much as I can. I was really interested in participating in the Ottoman Fellowship last summer because I really don't know a lot about Ottoman or Islamic art, and I really wanted my students to get a little taste of it and understand a different culture and different way of rendering images and using materials. So I designed a unit of study on Islamic art with an emphasis on the Ottomans, and there were 3 basic projects, but they were all sort of intertwined. So I'm going to just kind of run through what my objectives were for the lessons and show you some examples of student work. Let's see, I'm not able to move these, Deborah. I'm not able to, there we go. So my goal is how we can understand other traditions through art, because since my students are art majors, that's an avenue for them to get into other cultures. And also what we can learn from these cultures in terms of using some of the stuff they did, you know, using some of the techniques, using some of the imagery. I'm not interested in copying or getting my students to do something in the style of the Ottomans, but rather kind of dissecting the techniques and seeing what might be in there that they might be able to use.
Great. Deb, if you hit the forward arrow on the slides, it should advance the slides as you go.
They're not, it's not doing that.
Do you have the follow box checked?
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Is that it?
Yeah,
okay.
Once there's a check mark, it'll follow you.
Okay, but it's not.
Okay, well, I'm happy
got
to.
it highlighted. And if you want to, I can't seem to move them forward.
Just say forward and I'll switch them for you.
Okay, forward.
You want it on the
So I want to talk, can you do it? Yeah, they're just not moving for me.
Okay, which one do you want it on right now?
I'm ready for the next one after big idea.
Okay.
There we go. And should I just say next slide and then you can change it for me?
Sure.
Okay. So so we're looking at several things within the lesson. Some basics of Islam, which my students are not familiar with. I know in our group in Turkey, we had quite a few teachers who had large Islamic populations. I personally do not have a large one at my school, so I wanted to really give some information about this religion, but also some technical things in terms of dip pens and nibs, and I know a lot of teachers don't like to use India ink, but these projects could also be done with felt tip pens, but they would need to be chisel pens. Notan, which is the Japanese notion of balance. We looked at monogram ciphers and just the calligraphic line. Okay, next slide. So one of the first things we talked about was how being a calligrapher in the Ottoman Empire was the highest art art form, art career you could have because of their connection to copying the Quran and religious texts. To be a calligrapher, you had to study, you had to apprentice, you had to have a background of teachers that would impress people, and this is a diploma of a calligrapher, which lists all of the people that he studied with. Next slide. And then we also looked at calligraphy materials. These are boxes for calligraphy tools, just the most beautiful containers for the tools. And it really made resonance with my students who have little toolboxes and have their own tools, and the idea that these boxes were so fancy made them really help them understand how important calligraphers were. Next slide, you can just run through these steps. So here's some more tools. Bone tools, the cylinders are for holding the pens. The calligraphers would need to learn how to make their own pens, and just the intricate detail of the inlay and the gold on these was amazing. Okay, next. Here's another box for calligraphy tools. Next. Some bone folding tools. Next. And then, as Barb already mentioned, I was impressed in this early mosque by the broad sweep of these strokes of calligraphy. And I think in the United States we think of calligraphy as being wedding invitations and always writing. And I just was very impressed with the thick, thin quality of these lines and how broad and symbolic they were, but just as line themselves, they were so incredibly beautiful. This was a symbol that you see everywhere, the monogram for Muhammad and the monogram for Allah. Next. And you saw, we can run through these fairly quickly, but these are some of the turas that Barb showed you, and the sultan marks were standardized in some ways, but each sultan's mark was a little bit different. The intertwining quality of the lines where they overlap and the little spaces between them. Just as an artist, line is the most basic element of art. You can't make anything without a line, and so these lines are just really unusual. Next. And I think you'll see, you saw in Barb's slide, but you'll see coming up again the scale of these marks. Next. And here we get into this idea of noton, of positive, negative, of balance between black and white. Next. And here are the mirror image ones, which, as I understood, was a particular kind of skill and expertise that it took to make these perfectly symmetrical designs. Next. And more, this is also from Topkapi Palace. These marks are everywhere throughout the decorative arts that we saw in Turkey. Next. And these are contemporary carpets. I'm sure most of us are familiar with, you know, the antique and the beautiful Persian rugs and Turkish carpets. I was kind of intrigued in the mosques that these are modern carpets, replaced periodically because the mosque gets so much use, but the designs are still being used from traditional arabesques. Next. And these were kind of interesting. I had to ask Barb what these were because I saw them all over Istanbul, and they're just home decorations with the word of Allah or Muhammad or prayers, and people buy these and use them as decorations in their homes. Next. This is another form of calligraphy called a calligram, and my students were particularly interested in these animals, all kinds of organic forms. Next. The whirling dervish was a popular one that I saw throughout Istanbul and Turkey. Next. Next. So again, the line quality going from thick to thin, and the variety of the way the line curves in on itself and the different sizes of the lines. Next. Next. And I was able to see this amazing show in Turkey that is a fairly modern artist, probably Turkey's most famous contemporary modern artist of the 20th century. And I was really intrigued to see how the modern artists in Turkey were still using this calligraphic line in a very abstract expressionist way. This artist followed a Sufi tradition, and his paintings were very meditative and very, very large. Next. Next. So I thought the tie-in to contemporary work was really interesting, that this is so ingrained in the sensibilities of the Turkish people that these lines are continuing to be used. Next. And again, these are very large-scale paintings. Next. Next. So this is my project that I did with my students. I basically my objectives were that I wanted them to understand the origins and uses of calligraphy in the Ottoman Empire and also in the Arabic world. I wanted them to be able to use some of these properties of the line. I wanted them to be able to understand the differences between calligraphic forms like monograms, ciphers, turas, arabesques. I wanted them to gain experience and skill in the use of dip pens and India ink. And ultimately, we always have formal critiques where we reflect on the work, what we've learned, and give feedback to others. So my students had they had some choices of the projects they could do for this. They could do one of the calligrams like this, which is an image-based drawing filled with calligraphy lines. They could do a design with arabesques and the vine patterns that Barb was talking about. They could do a symmetrical mirror image. They could do a mandala or a radial design, and we have done mandalas before, so they're familiar with that form. Or they could do a bordered design that was like a rug design. Next. So a lot of them, I would say about half of the students chose to do the calligram filling with the line. And this is a final project. We had several exercises before this project where I just gave them pens and paper and they just made lines. I mean, they filled pages with lines and strokes and really got a feel for being very loose and free with the pens. Next. So this is 7th and 8th grade, and I think you teachers out there can see that most of these things could be done with elementary school kids or you know, shooting it up a notch for high school. Next. So these are some of the mandala designs that are also symmetrical. Some of them added borders to them. Next. 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 Okay, so the next unit that the next project we did was a sacred architecture, and my experience of being in these buildings in Turkey was just the scale. Barb talked a lot about that, and the feeling of being in the mosque with hundreds of other people. We started this project by looking at a variety of religious buildings, and my goal for this project was to get students to understand that there's connections between a sacred building's design and the ideology of the group that practices within that building, that there is a function for the building, there's often a patron for the building, and the location. So all of these things kind of contribute to what the building is used for and its meaning and its design. I wanted my students ultimately to be able to create a building that had some resonance for them in terms of a sacred building. So next. So we looked at buildings as early as Stonehenge and talked about the sacred nature of what possibly went on there and the form of that building and why that might be in that particular shape. Next. Aztecs, next. Mayan, next. Indian, next. This is a modern church in Rome, not a very good slide, I'm sorry. Next. And then coming with an emphasis again on the Ottoman Empire and these domes and the idea that the minarets are not just decorative, but they actually serve a function. They serve the function of the 5 times a day call to prayer, that the domes create a light-filled space, a transformative space, not unlike the cathedrals in Europe, the Gothic cathedrals. Next. And we spent a lot of time talking about this religion while we were going through this unit. Next. Next. This is the blue mosque during Ramadan, which was really beautiful. Full moon. Next. So in talking about these spaces, what I witnessed in these spaces was that they were used for large, huge Friday afternoon prayers where hundreds and hundreds of people would be there. They were used for individual quiet prayer. Next. They were used for study. I would frequently see people sitting in the mosques just with a book, with the Quran or other religious books, just by themselves reading and studying. Next. And then here is Paula, I believe. And the interior spaces of the community of coming together and how sacred buildings often are about that. They're large because they want to make the individuals feel small, but they also want to encourage that community of people gathering in a large space together. Next. So my project was kind of a long-term thing. This is the final project again. The first thing the students were asked to do was to do some research on religious architecture and see if they could identify some characteristics. And this is from all countries and all time periods. And some of the things we noticed was that they were large interior spaces, domes, naves, tall buildings. They had a lot of decoration, sometimes inside, sometimes out. They made man feel small. They were built to last. The dominant shapes that we saw were domes, ziggurats, rectangles, and then light as a main element. So the students were then asked to design a building based on an ideology that they invented, or they could use a traditional religion. Most of them chose, though, to do a building that would be for either contemplation of nature or some kind of meditation. Because of our study of the Ottomans, though, the dome figured prominently in their designs. And for the project, they had to do an exterior view, and it had to be shaded three-dimensionally. So this was further practice of our shading techniques on basic geometric shapes. They had to do a floor plan, and then they had to do a section that would show some area of decor in the building. And the decor, again, was to follow the ideology or the purpose of the building. I asked them to articulate what their belief system was for the building, the philosophy driving the building, the function of the building, what activity was to be performed there. Was it meditation? Was it group worship? I asked them to ask who the patron is, and most of them, they were the patron, but sometimes it was a king or someone else. And then the site, and what does the site have to do with the building? Is there running water? Is it by a stream? Is it by a lake? Next. And the final project involved taking that building and using it in a miniature painting. So these are students who studied traditional perspective and ways of rendering three-dimensional space in a scene. And what we focused on was the different way of depicting space in these Persian and Ottoman miniatures. The spatial differences in a hierarchy of what is closest and what's furthest away, as opposed to being made smaller or placed in perspective. Things are usually on top that are further away. Lots of pattern, as Barb mentioned, and intensely bright colors, which have remained because these were mostly in manuscripts. So they were protected well and have retained their color. And the kinds of subjects that were done. Barb showed you some of them. Processions, political events, portraits. Next. So when we look at these spatially, we see the thing that's furthest away is highest up in the picture, as opposed to being overlapped in the background. We see no shading or shadows, minimal shading sometimes in the faces, but never any shadow. So there's no light source, really. We talked about how these artists were not trying to depict the real world, but more the perfect world. Next. So these are the same slides Barb showed you. Next. 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 So finally, here is a picture of the combined project. The final project had to have a human, a nature element, some calligraphy, which you may not be able to see in all of them because some of them are fairly small, and the three-dimensional building. Next. So here is one of the miniatures. These were done in colored pencil and some ink, but pretty much mostly colored pencil. So the building that they designed is in the miniature, people, nature. Next. So here is one of the building plans. This is a mushroom-shaped building with its interior design element, its floor plan. Next. And then put in a scene. And this is a seventh grade student. Next. This was a building that had a moon worship theology, and she's got her elements. So the element in this one was a carpet design, but some of them had dome designs or column designs, wherever they wanted to show an element. Next. And here's her Persian miniature. So some people used the calligraphy. I mean, it doesn't say anything, although I did have a few students actually look up words on the internet and try to copy them. But for the most part, they were decorative. Next. So you can see a lot of them have domes. Next. Next. Not all the buildings were traditional. We had some that were very modern. So this is a glass building that was designed to be, appreciative of nature and be in a mountain setting. But you can see that the decoration was very Islamic and very geometric. Next. And here's her building just kind of way in the background, up high in the picture. Next. I don't have a picture of her building plan, but in this one you can see she used the calligraphy just as decoration on the columns, so it didn't have to be inserted as if it was writing. Next. And here's another modern one. Next. And they really incorporated a lot of light into the buildings, which came from our study of the mosques also. Next. And that's it.
Okay. Deb, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see how an art teacher can take back some ideas and make something new and give students the scope to make something new on their own while still learning about a culture and what form meant to them. So thank you for that wonderful tour of that work. I'd like to invite everyone now to ask questions of our presenters by either using the chat box in the bottom of the left-hand column and just hitting enter when you've written your comment, or by raising your hand, which is done by pressing the small hand that will appear under your name in the participant box. So it's the third icon from the left. I'm very curious what you all think of the work that you've seen and the ideas that have been shared, and would love to know what you'd like to know more about. So take a moment and type your question in the chat box. While we are getting thoughts together, I wanted to ask a question of Deb Rosenbaum about the amount of time and kind of modeling of some of the Ottoman inspirations that you spent before the students were given the sort of scope to create on their own. What was that process like?
Well, we looked, I try to have the kids do some of the research on their own. So with the case of the buildings, they spent almost a whole class period working in small groups. I have tons of books and art history books, and they could also use the internet. So they just researched buildings, and I asked them to come up with a list of characteristics that they started to see with these religious buildings. And so that was kind of an introduction for them to just start looking at some different examples. And then I went into the specifics of a slideshow that I have made on religious buildings, and then my own slides that I had made in Turkey of the mosques, and trying to kind of get them to understand that why the mosque is designed the way it is. We've talked a little bit in the past about Christian churches and why they are in the shape they are, and how that shape evolved, and how there's certain symbolism to the shape of the cross of the church. And so I wanted them to understand that there is always a theology and a patronage that are driving the design of these buildings. They don't just happen in a vacuum, and how the buildings are used. So I have the advantage of having my students every day for 90 minutes, and I know that's not what most art teachers have, or classroom teachers. So, you know, giving the students a little bit more of the responsibility of doing some of the legwork and finding examples themselves, I think, is stuff that can be done for homework, or shortening. You know, I did this as 3 projects, but certainly any one of them could have been done on its own. I think I spent about a month total on this unit.
Great. Thank you, Deb. Paul Chamberlain has posted a question about the woman photographer taking photos in the sacred space. I think that might refer to the image that you showed, Barbara. Do you want to address whether women are segregated during Friday worship?
Sure, I'm happy to take that on. Yes, in general, in most mosques, with the exception of a few radical ones here and there in the U.S., women are segregated during worship in mosques, just like in synagogues. Typically, the women's gallery in a classical Ottoman mosque would be up above, or sometimes now they're behind. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. So, yes, on Friday, in fact, anytime in one of the large mosques, women would be segregated during prayer. However, when it's not prayer time, and when people are visiting in a mosque, there's no restriction about where people can go from one, from one gender or the other. And in fact, there's this mosque that I just put down in here. It's actually spelled just with an S with a little tail on it in Turkish. I'm not sure if I can get it to actually accept a Turkish keyboard in the little box here. But this mosque called the Shakirin Mosque is a mosque that was designed by a female architect, and it has a very, very different design. So yeah, it's not going to let me type in Turkish. But if you look at that Shakirin Mosque, you'll see that it has a very different kind of feminine or female aesthetic that she draws on. It's much more organic in some ways, but it still has all the major components of a mosque, and there's still a separate place for women to pray. In this mosque, actually, that's the best place to be. but yeah, women are typically segregated.
Thanks, Barb.
Is it possible that Paul might be talking about the picture that is actually Paula in where she has her headscarf on, so he might be confused that might be a worshiper. We had to cover our heads in all the mosques, and that was actually somebody in our group, and we took tons of pictures inside the mosques, and so that is not forbidden.
I think that's what that was.
Yeah, and it wasn't during
even Muslim women will visit these mosques as kind of semi-tourists, so people will make a habit, for example, of going. I mean, in Turkey in particular, where Friday is not a day off, Turkey has a Monday to Friday business schedule, so people will often go to mosques on the weekend to visit if they're religious. So they're not going for congregational prayer. In fact, very few women actually go to congregational prayer on Friday. It's not required of women. It is required of men. So most women pray in their homes, even on Friday. However, if you go, for example, to a shrine or a mosque that has a shrine, like the Shrine of Eyüp in Istanbul, on Sunday morning, they have thousands of people, including hundreds of women, who go to participate in prayer at that mosque. So you have people who go and visit the mosque at not prayer times, as well as people who go during prayer. And at not prayer times, there's no segregation in the mosque space.
Thanks, Barb. Deb, question for you. As an art teacher, do you work with colleagues in the history department, creating cross-curricular connections?
I don't, but well, yes and no. We have very strict curriculum for academics in my school that have to be followed by the state, and I have a lot more flexibility to plan what I want to plan, but I have made a point of trying to study other cultures so that I would have that background. I have a minor in history, but I did just take students to Spain, for instance, and I took a history teacher with me, and he was really instrumental in giving background to the kids about Spanish history. And so our travel uses more of that, but for instance, it's difficult to collaborate with an AP history teacher because their curriculum is so very structured, and we don't always have the same kids. So a visual art major may not, an AP history teacher may have visual artists, dancers, all different kinds of art majors in their classes. So not a lot of collaboration in that way.
Thanks. Barb, do you see the question about Muslim cultures and representation? Is it just a Turkish thing, or are there others where representational art is embraced?
Yes, there are many, many. I think that there's, I'm trying to put in, I don't know if I'm going to get a good, I don't know if you can, Deb, actually go on the internet and share your screen through this, but one example is, of course, there are also Persian miniatures and Arabic miniatures, although the Arab ones are far fewer than the Persian and Turkish ones. But even in the earliest buildings that Muslims made, there were figural mosaics. So in the heartland of Islam, you have this very strong tradition. The Indian miniature tradition is extremely strong, but also in other places. So this link that I posted here is actually from Senegal, where there's a very strong tradition, for example, of glass painting, reverse painting on glass, often with religious subjects. So you would find images of Noah's Ark or images of local saints or Marabu, and you find that quite a lot. You can go to Indonesia, for example. Indonesia and Turkey both have very strong puppetry traditions, shadow puppet traditions, where you have shadow puppets in Indonesia that are based on Islamic historical figures, and they will act out, for example, the passion play of the martyrdom of Hussein. So I think it's a really good question about where that comes from, and I think that it's partly because in religious buildings, you don't have, let me rephrase that, in Sunni mosques, you don't have representational art. Just like in a synagogue, you don't have representational art. And in fact, it may be that, Islam picks that up from the Jewish tradition because, of course, it grew up in a place where there were large numbers of Jews. So I think that aniconic tradition within the mosque itself and the very strong focus in Islam on the unity and singularity of God meant that for Sunnis that was a very important thing. But it's never been the case that Muslims didn't produce representational art. And I think it's because it's part of Orientalism. I mean, many people in the West still refuse to see any Muslim as anything but an iteration of Islam, as opposed to, you know, a human being with social and artistic and other kinds of needs and functions in society as well as the religious.
Great, thank you, Barbara. I think that we are actually out of time. It's 8 o'clock now, and probably out of questions as well for the moment. So I want to thank you both for a crash course in Ottoman arts and their application in classrooms. And we would love to hear what all of the other teachers on the webinar may do with this and what kind of projects you're doing. So please do contact us at Primary Source to find out more. We have an Ottoman resource guide that's interactive and has books, videos, links, slideshows that you can access, all kinds of resources that we developed for our Ottoman course and are happy to share at large. And it's located here, and this is where we will park the recording of this webinar for tonight if you wish to come back to it or share it with a colleague. Just before I say goodbye, I want to say that Primary Source has many offerings, of which webinars are only one. We run graduate courses, workshops, study tours, and really try to give teachers lots of different windows they can access to learn about the world and bring it back to students through the kind of model that you've seen and experienced here with Barbara and Deb. Please be in touch with us, follow us, visit our website where there are many, many more resources, and we will keep you abreast of what's new and different if you sign up for our newsletter at the address here. So that is all for tonight. Thank you for joining us and for the questions and thoughts that you've shared, and a big thanks to Deb and to Barbara for their work in putting this together and sharing their expertise.